Hi everybody, this is Carmen from On the Floor, and today we're doing a dry haircut on the wonderful Sylvia. And primarily this haircut is about a variety of texturizing techniques in order to basically deflate Sylvia's hair and get it to come to life and move and be a lot lighter. Her hair is naturally wavy slash curly, and we've already blown it out pretty smooth with a big natural boar's bristle round brush with the Kerastase Nectar Thermique and also the Kerastase Oleo Relax. And I've also run a flat iron basically from roots to sort of mid shaft just to really get her first few inches sitting down really smoothly. So just to start things off, we're taking about ½ inch off of the length here, and I'm point cutting that length off just to keep the line really soft. I'm also working a relatively square line right now. As I drop the next few sections, we'll go ahead and take off the corner on each side so that the perimeter sits a little more round and a little softer. So as we go, section by section, we are going to start our texturizing and removing weight while also taking off that ½ inch. So it's a really efficient way, obviously, to move through this haircut. This first technique that I'm doing right now is something I like to call slicing. I know that we all have a variety of terminology verbiage that we use to describe the various techniques that we use as hairdressers. For me, the sliding or slicing makes the most sense. And one thing that's really important to remember when you are using this technique is that degree of the blade as it approaches the inside of the section before you start actually cutting and slicing out. And what I mean by that is, if your blade is perpendicular or close to perpendicular to that strand of hair that's hanging out, you are going to be removing a very generous amount of hair initially when you first go into the section. And then as you come out and through the section, turning that blade to become more and more and more parallel with the strand of hair is going to reduce the amount of hair that you're actually removing. So in other words, if you want to be very generous with weight, you're going to approach the section of hair in terms of that interior with a relatively perpendicular blade and then fan out and become more parallel with the hair as you approach the ends. If you want to be conservative, you'll enter that hair in a more parallel fashion to begin with. So we've obviously gone through that first section, taken weight out of the last 5 or so inches, dropped the second section, and taken our ½ inch off. And now we're going to get back to our texturizing. And you'll see everything I just explained about that degree that we approach the hair right now. So I'm not coming in completely perpendicular, but it is quite close. And then you can see that blade turn and point out towards the ends as we get through the length. So it's the most generous inside that section of hair and the least generous and most conservative towards the ends. Now after I slice that weight out, what I like to do is come back out and look at the remaining ends a little closer to the end of the length, like 2 to 3 inches out, and just point cut softly the remaining weight throughout those ends. So we've got 2 techniques going on right now, just to review. We've got our slicing slash sliding, which is what you see right now, and then some point cutting very deeply into that remaining weight throughout the ends. Couple of things to think about, when you're texturizing, it's so easy because it's fun. I know we all have a good time texturizing hair. But it's very easy to kind of do it absent-mindedly and not really be thinking about, what technique am I using and why right now. A couple of, very basic things to always keep in mind. When we point cut into hair, frankly, when we remove weight in any technique, with any technique, when we do it deeply into a section, deeply into the length or interior of hair, we are being the most impactful with weight. When we start to get shallow and point cut or slice right into the ends or the least amount of length, at that point we're not really affecting weight anymore. We're mostly impacting length. And so if you're working with a section that has a length you really love, but it's just bulky, you know you're going to be approaching that interior relatively deeply. Now, obviously, we're not going up, near her scalp or anything like that. We're staying pretty much mid shafts through ends in this entire haircut. But we are definitely thinking about when we are working deeply and when we're working throughout the end. So you can see that now we're kind of getting closer to the layered part of her haircut, and also the crown section, which of course is sitting more and more into the outer area of this haircut. We're no longer really deep and underneath, like in that nape or occipital bone area. And so for that reason, as we are starting sort of into that area that's exposed on the outside of the hair, we're getting a little less aggressive. We're not going quite as deep into each section. We're really just looking for extra weight, like right there, that's sitting through the ends, that's making her hair sit very heavily and not really move. And granted, she has a very layered haircut, but because her density is so extreme, and also because of her natural texture when it's curly, you really can't see that layered shape and that lightness that's structurally built into the haircut. So removing the weight really helps. That last technique you just saw right there, by the way, is kind of using the blades of your scissors to mimic a razor. Now, this is not a natural texture that I personally feel should be razored traditionally with a razor. However, the blade of your scissor used appropriately in that sense is a really great asset. And so you'll see right now I'm coming through right into those heavy, heavy corners behind her ear, a little further down, and taking some weight out pretty aggressively right there. So last section, in terms of the back, we're dropping the crown, and you can see how deflated that underneath has already become, and how heavily these short layers on top and in her crown sit. So just kind of taking a minute to look at those, and now basically going to go back to our fairly straightforward point cutting, looking at the last like 2.5 to 3 inches, and just softly point cutting into that weight. This is a kind of point cutting that I particularly enjoy, and I like to call notching. And the reason I like to call it notching is because I think point cutting often implies that you are actually breaking the perimeter of a section or coming directly into the ends with your point cut, versus looking at those ends and taking weight right on top of the remaining hair that you're looking at. In other words, directly on top of the section versus into the ends of that section. So that's kind of how I make a determination, or a distinction rather, between regular point cutting and a more aggressive weight removal. So that last technique that you saw right there, I feel like that's a really great way to lighten ends, particularly throughout a shape that's sitting right on top of the hair. And I kind of like to call that a reverse point cutting, where or reverse notching, where you're basically kind of slicing out, but in a sort of shallow way, which is, I just think, a really great way to soften ends. So to kind of wrap up the haircut overall, I'm just going to keep it moving quickly. We're taking off about 1 inch off the sides with a nice, relatively shallow round angle. And then we're going to move through the sides section by section with these vertical sections to remove weight the same way we did in the back, although you can see that it's quite a bit less aggressive. We're really just looking at the last couple of inches and point cutting and notching some weight out, and then making sure that we like the way that lower part of the side is sitting with the back that we've already done. I like to break down Sylvia's hair into 3 sections on the side: a lower parietal ridge, an upper parietal ridge, and then of course the last section being from the parting on top of her hair. or on top of her head rather. She just has so much hair that you really can't handle it in any bigger sections than that. So go ahead and looking at the perimeter, looking at the weight, dropping that last section again, kind of like in the back when we dropped the top before. That top, those short layers sit so heavily. So just kind of going right into some notching, taking some relatively wide bands out, and then after we reduce the weight of those ends, we'll go ahead and actually soften the line right there. So a little bit of weight removal plus some actual softening of ends that, again, it's important to remember will shrink the length. And one of the reasons why I'm going ahead and sort of sacrificing length here when I point cut like that right there into the ends is because we haven't actually removed any length off of these layers. Her haircut, as far as the interior is concerned, for me was plenty short, and those layers really didn't need to go any shorter. But I'm willing to push it sort of just a little bit with that point cutting on the ends that I know will shrink things. And lastly, just doing a bit more with a horizontal section throughout the top instead of the vertical section softens things a little more aggressively. This is the end result. And just to remind us, this is what Sylvia's hair was like before we reduced the weight. You can see it's quite dense, and this is the end.